This week, Evan went from a fresh-faced recruit to a ruthless war machine. And that was before we watched Oliver Stone's Platoon.
Welcome back to How Did You Miss This? A show where we watch movies that some of us missed the first time around. I'm Evan Toller-Hickey, and with me as always, Michael Hansen and Chris DeShane. And today we are going to be talking about Oliver Stone's seminal Vietnam War movie, 1986's Platoon. Am I the only one who missed this? I think I might be. Chris?
Yes. Yeah, it's you.
It's just
you. I didn't miss this movie. I've seen this movie a whole bunch of times. This is, I don't know, once every few years, like once a decade or, 5-6 years, whatever it is, kind of rewatch for me. I mean, it's I don't want to say it's a favorite, but I think it's a really good movie. So I was surprised when you hadn't seen this. I was like, oh, well, this is maybe another good one that we should get in front of Evan's eyes.
Yeah, completely agree. Like this is one of those that I watched when it first came out, and I was old enough. I am old enough that the Vietnam War had a resonance, like it actually kind of still echoed. So for me, it had that whole thing growing up, and it really meant something. And it was so much in all the references we had, like when Rambo came out, and it was still like really fresh about being a Vietnam War vet. So yes, I've watched this a few times since, and I'll be really interested in hearing what you think about it.
Well, this one weirdly slipped through the cracks for me. I mean, certainly I was too young to see it when it came out. But I've seen Full Metal Jacket many, many times, and I really love that film. I've seen Apocalypse Now many, many times. And this is kind of the third movie in kind of that holy trinity of Nam movies. And it, not unlike In Bruges, I own this on DVD. I have never watched it. I got it thinking, oh man, Platoon, I'm definitely going to watch that, and never got around to it. So
I feel like there's a sad closet in your house, Evan, that like if we opened it is just going to like bombard us with like old DVDs falling on our heads from all the movies you never got to. Yeah, exactly. Perfect mint condition DVDs that were never ever
it's going to be
watched.
worth something someday. I just keep telling myself that. So Oliver Stone, he's a director that a writer and director that has a pretty huge footprint in Hollywood. I really knew him from things like Natural Born Killers and The Doors and JFK. I hadn't realized that he had written Midnight Express, which he had also won an Academy Award for, and that he had written Conan the Barbarian and Scarface.
Yeah.
Totally blew my mind.
Yeah. I mean, he's got quite a string of stuff through the kind of early 80s and on, because he also wrote and directed Wall Street right after he did Platoon. And then he did Born on the 4th of July not too long after that. So, I mean, he has quite a string of both writing and directing credits. Most of the stuff he was directing was his stuff that he had written in some way. It played a huge part in. And I think the interesting part is, for him, this is the real start of his launch pad into those movies, right? He's gotten some recognition, winning the Academy Award for Midnight Express for best adapted screenplay. But it's not until he writes and directs Platoon that he really becomes a Hollywood notable.
Maybe that he becomes Oliver Stone.
Yeah, exactly. To a pretty amazing run over the next decade after 1986, because over that decade, I mean, we just listed off a bunch of those, but after Platoon, it's Wall Street, Born on the 4th of July, The Doors, JFK, Natural Born Killers, Nixon, Evita, like that's the next 10 years, and a bunch of those movies scoop up or a ton of nominations at the Academy Awards. So it's quite a run for him.
You know, as you were saying, Chris, it is Oliver Stone's Platoon, and it truly is one of those things that really kind of surprised me when we were doing the research for the show, was that Oliver Stone himself was in Vietnam from the age of 19 to 21, and had volunteered to go there, not unlike the Charlie Sheen character in the movie. That just genuinely kind of blew my mind. The level of authenticity that he was bringing to this, I think, is really shines through.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're bang on, Evan. This is very much a, pseudo autobiographical movie. He was writing right after he came out of the war. He wrote another movie called Break, which never got produced, but he basically used his experiences in Vietnam to write that. He wound up going into film school, and that's where he then got into writing Midnight Express, and then he basically used that original script to turn it into Platoon. The only reason it wasn't made sooner was he just had this incredible difficulty getting this movie made, because he wanted it to be so genuine and authentic to the experiences of what he had lived in Vietnam, that basically nobody wanted to see that movie, because they're like, it's too dark, it's too real, it's too gritty, it's too sad, it's too much of a bummer. And this is kind of also on the other side of, I mean, you mentioned Apocalypse Now. It was also after Deer Hunter had come out. So people were like, we think this whole Vietnam War movie thing's being covered. We've had those Vietnam War movies. We're good. And he actually had to basically try 3 or 4 times before he could actually get this movie made. He'd essentially moved on to some degree because he thought it was never going to get made, and it only wound up getting picked up because he was making another movie, Salvador, all about the war in Central America, and kind of this, what he saw as this slide into another Vietnam War that America was headed towards again. That Hemsdale, the company who was making or financing Salvador, said, well, whatever. Well, this is a pretty good script. We'll do this one too. And so they actually financed both movies back to back. And he wound up basically living in a jungle for like the better part of a year, first in Mexico, and then he flew off to the Philippines to film Platoon at the beginning of 1986. So, I mean, it's a pretty long, arduous path for him to actually get this movie made. And I think the crazy part is he made this movie on a $6 million budget. So if we talk about Stand By Me, which is one of our alumni movies made in the same year as this, that movie where you've got 4 young kids basically wandering through the woods, cost $8 million to make. This was made, this is a war movie with like a large ensemble, explosions and battles and all this stuff going on, made for $6 million. Right? Like to put a war drama together for a fraction of the budget is pretty shocking. And I think we'll probably spend a fair amount of time talking about how that was done and how that kind of like low budget influenced a large part of what they did. But yeah, shot in early 1986, out by the end of the year, and just a year apparently that was pretty miserable living in jungles. So
after living in the jungle for a year and after trying so hard for so long to get this made, it was super gratifying for him to be nominated for, 8 Academy Awards and winning like Best Picture and Best Director. Film also picked up Best Film Editing, Best Sound Mixing. So it was definitely worth it. The Academy wasn't Vietnamed out. This has been one of American Film Institute's top 100 films. It is constantly in top lists, especially of war films, 89% on Rotten Tomatoes. So, Michael, after coming back and rewatching this film, what were your thoughts? How do you feel about it?
I think this is an outstanding movie. It has appealed to me at every point in my life. I watched it when it first came out. And like I said, it represented something when I was young And then I watched it with, and I mentioned it before, but our now 17-year-old son, because I wanted him to see it. So we discussed it. And then I had a chance to kind of watch it again now with the three of us and really kind of look at it again. And every time I've seen something new, I think it is an incredibly nuanced view of war and what people go through. And it's got something for everyone. And I enjoy it every time I watch it.
Yeah, I'll say it's maybe not the most light entertaining watch. I mean, it's a pretty war movie. There's got a lot of like, this is kind of a sad thing in a lot of ways to watch this movie, but I will say like it still holds up for me after all these years. I think it's also one of the things I find interesting about this movie is this is a movie that is about the Vietnam War more than anything else. Whereas some of those other movies that you mentioned, Evan, like, you know, Apocalypse Now or Deer Hunter or whatever, like those are movies that are about something else that take place during the Vietnam War movie. Whereas this is very strictly, or not strictly, but like very intentionally about the war and the experiences of the people who were there, in the same way that, All Quiet on the Western Front is a story about World War I. And sure, you can draw other war parallels out or other things that you want to, but like it is definitely a thing that's rooted.
It's interesting you say that, because there are two things. One is, I'm not sure like this says much about the war other than the day-to-day experience of the war. It doesn't explain the background of war. It doesn't explain why someone's doing it. Why are they sending people across the world in a good way? Like, I think that by focusing on the individuals, it actually makes it a better movie. So it's more about the individual's experience fighting this war, more so than the war itself. Like, why is it being fought? What are people doing? It doesn't get into that at all, like whatsoever. The second thing is this whole notion of the glorifying the war and making it sort of really cool versus showing the reality. I think they do it really well, but similar to one of his other movies. So you mentioned Wall Street. I thought it was the funniest thing I'd heard him say in an interview before, was that there were so many people that would come up to him afterwards and say, "Oh, your movie is why I got into Wall Street." And it's like, no, that was not.
That's not what I want at all.
Which is a little bit the same here. Yeah, it's like, this is war. Is not cool yet. You walk away afterwards, especially like 15-year-old me. I was like, wow, that was so cool.
So, Evan, as the newcomer to Platoon, how did you find it? What was your thoughts after seeing it?
This movie is great. It is a truly excellent piece of art. It is well written. It's well executed. Some phenomenal performances in it. It's extraordinarily well directed and edited. And I'm thrilled that this movie came up in our little podcast to make me take a look at it. So big thumbs up from me.
There you go. Well, let's take a quick break. And when we come back, we'll get into the meat of this and talk about all the ins and outs that made this movie happen. And welcome back. So we're going to be talking about all the stuff that happens in Platoon. If you haven't seen the movie and you don't want it spoiled, then run away, because otherwise we're going to be getting into the details of this movie. So as a recap for all of us about what is this movie about. So this movie follows Chris Taylor. He's a young volunteer who's just arriving in Vietnam, and he's joining this platoon that is essentially split between these two sergeants. You've got the ruthless and calculating Sergeant Barnes on the one hand, and the more humane and moral Sergeant Elias on the other. And as he kind of witnesses and participates in this brutal, chaotic conflict, he struggles with the morality of the war itself and his own actions. The tension essentially builds up between these two sergeants until eventually they reach a breaking point and this dramatic and tragic climax. So, as a starting point on this, we kind of touched on it up the top, but this is a movie and a story that feels very authentic. And so I don't know if there's certain things that call out for each of you here, but like how real, lived in, authentic does this story feel to each of you?
Incredibly. Like, I think the way that they started, it's so, I love the way that they introduce everything. Like you say, arrive fresh faced. You see the meeting, the people who've been there for a while, the vets. You see the first experience of just being in the jungle and falling, the ants biting, the water, the constant fatigue. Like, it just so quickly establishes, like, wow, this is nothing like what they probably would have been told from back home when they joined, or what they thought that they were going to do. So watching it, I just think, like, it is such a terrific way to, within 7 minutes, establish the shift in, you walk off that plane and versus the reality on the ground. So for me, it is, I just love how they portray this thing before a single bullet has been shot.
Absolutely, Michael. I agree 100%. And one of the things that I particularly liked, as you say, it comes off the plane, you've got all these fresh-faced recruits. They're seeing the body bags. They're seeing these grizzled veterans. And there's a whole lot of characters right off the top. And there's a lot happening, but it's all done very close so that you know that there's a lot of people there. You can't really distinguish them off the top beyond sort of like, okay, that's Charlie Sheen. And even then, back when this movie was shot, he was not a big name. So you've got this group of people, and then people just start dying. And so it's like, oh, I'm not sure I even knew that character's name. And he's just had his head blown off. And yeah, that seems basically right, and right in the worst way, like just very authentic. And I mean, again, not surprising. You've got Stone himself, who had served 2 years in Nam, which again blows my mind that such formative years of his life, age 19 to 21, he's there fighting. He had a Bronze Star awarded to him. He got 2 Purple Hearts. That's for being wounded in battle. So, and I also found out that he had lived in Vietnam even before the war, in South Vietnam, teaching English. So he has this kind of love for the country, and then also this level of knowledge of it from fighting in it. It's really interesting to see that translated to the screen, and to see the character of Chris Taylor as basically the avatar for Stone and his experiences throughout the war.
The people too feel like they could be real people. Like, to your point, Evan, it's some of them you don't necessarily, even by the end of the movie, remember some of their names, but you're like, okay, I get who these people are, even though I'm only getting them in little snippets. And I think a lot of those, that goes back to Oliver Stone and saying, like, I'm trying to reflect the real people who I served there with. Sure, some of them got, mashed together, but, especially when you come down to Barnes and Elias, the two, like big heavyweights in this movie, played by Willem Dafoe and Tom Berenger, like, those were based on real people, right? Real platoon sergeants that he had. He talked about how Barnes is essentially a guy who he served for. He carried his radio, and he dealt with them firsthand. And he was this kind of ruthless, win at all costs kind of character. And so I think there's something interesting when he talks about, like, the characters and where they came from, because they're rooted in somebody who you aren't just kind of like making up in your head, but you've seen do real things in the real world, which for me in some ways fleshes these characters out even more. And you feel like there's more that all of these characters understand about each other because they've been serving for a while and they have these stories. And you don't always get the full background, but I think for me, that's a big part of it, is just knowing that there is so much more behind all of these characters than, what we see or whatever, hear or learn in the movie. And it definitely plays out that way for me.
But it's interesting you say that, because I think a trope that I usually don't enjoy, like, is this whole thing around trying to go into exposition about people. But they use this thing in this movie about the letters back to grandma that I think works exceedingly well, because there's a voiceover where he talks, essentially, he has a chance to explain his experience in a way that does not feel like spoon feeding. And he talks about like this whole thing that, no one wants to teach the new people how to do things. No one wants to essentially get to know them or help them with anything, because they know that the new people are essentially going to die straight away. So in establishing that, it means that the new ones, you don't even need to know. You don't want to know their names. You don't want to know their backgrounds. You don't want to know anything about them. So they get the point across, I think, very well, where it's like, no, it's the fat guy, it's this guy, it's that guy. But then over time, you start to kind of get to know them a little bit better, and a little bit better, a little bit better. And I think that translates super well in this movie in a way that would be very easy to screw up by over-explaining everything.
I think you're right. And I think it also helps set the tone right off the bat for these two seminal characters of Barnes and Elias, because right from the get-go, you've kind of got this moral conflict between the two, where Barnes just needs bodies going out on ambush in the middle of the night. And Elias is saying, well, you can't send the new guys out. Like, that's not fair. They just got here. What are you going to do? And sure enough, that guy who nobody remembers his name gets killed because he's one of the new guys. And, it's one of the first points where you see Elias and Barnes come into conflict, because Elias is saying, well, if you'd given them a chance to actually learn anything, maybe one of these guys wouldn't be dead right now, right? So I think it not only kind of sets it up as this shocking awakening, but also sets up that conflict of ideologies between those two so well right off the bat.
Yeah, I think that is a really interesting piece of this film, is that you do have this sort of moral struggle. Like, really, the film is you could look at it, I guess, as a metaphor for the struggle for Chris Taylor's soul. You've got Barnes on one side and Elias on the other, one who is win at all costs and destroy everything that gets in your way, and the other one who is leading with compassion. And that sort of push-pull that happens throughout the film for Taylor's character. And you get to a point in the end where things, so much horror has happened, so many sort of little beautiful moments of friendship, ? It's certainly band of brotherhood. And you have Taylor lifting out and stating pretty plainly that he wants to take all of what he learned from the destruction and the horror of the war and build something out of it, teach future generations not to make the mistake, and to make something so that all of this wasted life won't be a waste. And that makes me go like, oh, is that what Platoon is? Is that really Stone stating his thesis plainly? I was in this horrible, horrible war. I am going to try to make something good out of it. I am going to try to create out of the destruction. Here's what I have done.
So in terms of the narrative arc that this story tells, I mean, we go from the fresh-faced recruit, getting sent out on ambush on like his first day in the jungle, living through these horrors, and then coming to this kind of like dramatic conclusion at the end. Like, how do you feel that the entire arc of this story plays out? Is that an effective storytelling arc for you?
I think it's brilliant. I think it is what we find out, and again, in this non-spoon feeding way, we find out, just like everyone else, that he actually volunteered to go. And he volunteered because it was driven by this idea that it shouldn't just be the poor kids that have to go. Like, we should all do it. And so for me, to see that story bit by bit and what he goes through and his realization of his experience, his fellow soldiers, what I mentioned earlier about, it's not about the war itself. Like there's no bigger, broader geopolitical commentary in this whatsoever. It's just about these people, the grunts who fight with each other, and then the leaders or lack of leadership. That to me is incredibly satisfying, the experience of it, showing essentially how do you go from the person who comes off the plane to the person he sees and he has that exchange with, the eye contact, the super grizzled, sad-eyed veteran. Like, how do you go from that to the other one? That to me is incredibly satisfying in this.
Well, I think also to your point, Michael, I have in my notes, when that moment where we find out that he had actually volunteered to go, I'm like, holy crap. Like he volunteered for this. And on the surface, him saying that it shouldn't just be the poor kids who fight the wars, but he's also going there for self-knowledge and searching through war for self-knowledge and self-worth, to know that his father and grandfather had both served in different wars as well, that he is trying to find his place, I think, in his family, that deeper level of what kind of man he truly is. And that then really does set him up perfectly to be a foil for that push-pull between Barnes and Elias.
I think he is trying to figure out what sort of person he is. I mean, just look at the little things. He's not writing to his father or his grandfather. It's not, to prove who I am. The fact that he's writing to his grandmother is kind of like clue number one. The second thing, he's not coming in to kind of show I'm the biggest, toughest guy in this platoon. But he's trying to figure out what sort of person am I in life? What does it mean to be a person growing up? And I think that is more universal. I think that could appeal to almost everyone, at any stage, because you're just kind of figuring out like who am I in the world? Where do I fit in? Yeah. Am I more this or am I more that?
I agree. And don't get me wrong. When I say like trying to figure out what kind of man I am, I don't mean, the sort of like, buffed up Barnes, although he could have gone very much that way and gone the way of Confederate flag waving, Jack Daniels drinking, machine gun firing, Barnes, but he chooses to be a different person.
Well, I think that's part of it for me. So I'll just say, for me, the village scene is it's a tough watch. Like that is a tough thing to watch, because it is all of these things coming into this very, very tight focus of all of these moral dilemmas, which, to your point, Evan, before it was just like a group of soldiers who maybe didn't always agree, but now it's coming into this sharp focus of just the level of conflict that exists between everyone there.
And here's this group of people that whatever else that they disagree on, they have been fighting together. They've been going through all these dangers together. And here's this crucial point where they feel here's this one place that we've been ordered to go to. They've had a very visible display of a brutal killing and then being strung up of one of their grunts, one of their fellow soldiers. And that is kind of like the trigger point. They walk into this village with all of that shared experience, with this recent death and this anger, and it's just like this powder keg that is about to be set off.
And they even set it up that way, right? Where they say like they didn't even know what was coming, kind of thing. Like, oh boy, this rage and anger that's now being built up in us, not just from this one very visible killing, but losing some other guys just before that as well. It's now created this kind of a storm that's just about to hit this village, and I think that's where the interesting part kind of really comes in for me, between I mean, Barnes and Elias as these figureheads, because I think a lot of these characters are having that same struggle as Taylor, or maybe they've had that struggle and resolved where they lie on both what kind of person they are and where they stand on their beliefs about this war and how it should be fought or how they're going to fight it. But it's that moment in the village where that story for Chris Taylor comes in, and you see this fracture down kind of the middle between these two groups, all of these different folks, all centered around Tom Berenger and Willem Dafoe. And so maybe this is a good point to ask that question. Like, what is this movie without Dafoe and Berenger?
God. I mean, nothing. Like, well, you know what? No, I will say that their performances are so fantastic. They're both so freaking good. Maybe other actors could have pulled it off, but wow, they just nail it. Berenger is so scary and macho, and looking into his eyes is terrifying. And Willem Dafoe has such kind eyes, and it's so nice to see him not play a villain and play someone who has a really strong moral compass. And he's such a weird looking dude, but his face is so full of character. And that moment where it just does a close up of where he smiles when he sees Berenger come out of the woods, being like, oh
yeah, he thinks he's safe. He's got a friend.
And then it just goes close on his eyes, and you can just see the muscles in his cheeks drop as he realizes that, oh, he's about to be murdered.
I think that is bang on. Like what would the movie be without the two characters, and what would the movie be without these particular actors? Because the characters are critical. You need the two characters to represent this and that. And what I particularly really like about it is that neither of them are black and white. Like even the Tom Berenger character, like you understand that he's there to protect his people. He wants to get them through. He wants to do a good job. He wants to do certain things. He's driven by some sort of, he's got a cause. It's not just about, I'm here to kill people. But then also these particular actors couldn't have been better cast because, like you say, like the acting, particularly the things that you brought out, just without saying a word, just with the facial expressions, the change of kind of intensity in the eye, you go, whoa. That it was just like some incredible acting between the two, in not just how they act with each other, but then also how they act with managing up with the lieutenant, how they work with their peers and their various kind of like people in the squad. They're just unbelievable.
I will say too that I think one of the really interesting things for me is when these two were cast, Oliver Stone basically cast them against type. So to Evan's point, up to this point, Dafoe had been a villain and he wanted to cast him as the good guy, and Berenger had usually been the good guy, and now he's the scarred, ruthless leader of this group. I think the fascinating thing though is both of them have these moments where they can have that duality, right? So Barnes has these moments of contemplation or sadness or whatever, when that one group gets killed by the mine in that like bunker. He's got this like moment of just like clearly like feeling like sad, disappointed, like he's messed up or something. And you just like, it's that one moment where Chris Taylor sees him. He's like, oh, maybe this guy's a little bit human. And then later on when Barnes comes into the bunker with the rest of the group, and he's all over them because he's yelling at them, and he's yelling at them for smoking joints or whatever. And he's saying, you guys, you need to smoke this stuff to escape reality. And then immediately takes a giant swig of bourbon or whatever out of the bottle. And it's like, okay, you have the same challenges. Clearly, it's just you don't like the marijuana. But I found that in both of them, because Elias too has these moments where he's this kind, caring, thoughtful thing, but then he has that moment too where he's like, all right, now I'm going to go kill a whole bunch of these guys because that's my job right now. And I can turn off that humane, caring part of me, because right now my job is to be the best killing machine I can be. So I'm going to go off on my own to make sure we don't get flanked and wipe out a bunch of guys on my own. And so it's just, I find, neither's entirely the devil or angel sitting on the shoulder. They both kind of have those moments where you see that maybe they both started just like Chris Taylor, in the middle or something, and found their way to the other extremes. And I think that their acting choices really help play that out for the two of them. Now, one of the other things I definitely want to talk about this cast is this is a cast of a whole bunch of newbies. Like there's a bunch of people in this movie who we know, like everybody knows. So whether that's Charlie Sheen in one of his first major roles, or a whole list of names. So we've got Keith David, Forrest Whitaker, Kevin Dillon, John C. McGinley, Mark Moses, a bunch of these guys, Johnny Depp, who barely appears in the movie, but he's in the movie. A whole list of people who either their names, or if you saw them, you'd be like, oh, hey, that guy. And a lot of these folks, this was the launching pad for their movie. And one of the interesting things for me was Oliver Stone was very intentional about trying to cast this movie with actors who were the right age for the folks he'd been in Vietnam with. So he has this cast of essentially 19, 20, 21-year-olds, just like he was. A number of folks had aged out of kind of being in the running for these roles. So he'd originally wanted to actually cast Emilio Estevez in the role of Chris Taylor. And then Emilio, 5 years older than Charlie Sheen, kind of aged out of it as it took him 10 years to make this movie. Next thing you know, you've got his little brother. So there's a number of other folks who dropped out too. But I think it's interesting that we went from Emilio Estevez to Charlie Sheen, both sons of Martin Sheen, who is the star of Apocalypse Now. Like, do you think that's an intentional choice that Oliver Stone is making to do this point back to this seminal Vietnam War movie?
I would love that it had been that calculated. I have a feeling that it was just that he was the right guy eventually for it. Maybe with Emilio Estevez. I wonder if that had been very intentional casting, because Emilio Estevez also looks more like Martin Sheen.
Also, $6 million.
Yeah.
He had to stick to $6 million.
Had to stick to $6 million. But, I also know that Keanu Reeves had been up for the role before Charlie Sheen ended up taking it. The funny thing being is apparently Keanu ultimately turned it down because he didn't like the violence. He just didn't want to do the violence. Cut to The Matrix, cut to John Wick's 1, 2, 3, and 4.
Yes. To your point, Evan, like there's a lot of those names of folks who we now would be like, oh my God, why that guy wasn't in the movie? So folks like Denzel Washington, Nick Nolte, Kevin Costner, Mickey Rourke, like all these folks who at that period were just starting their ascent, and partly drawn, I think, by the writing. But as he actually nails down these folks who reflect the people who he had been in Vietnam with, they start. And the first thing he did, which is a kind of recurring theme for a lot of the movies we've talked about, is this boot camp to like really make them understand what this experience is like. And so they basically ship all of these young actors who are in their early days off into the middle of the jungle to live in the jungle for a couple weeks. I heard an interview with Charlie Sheen where he's like, so we got dropped off on the first day, we spent a day learning how to shoot M16s and, how to wear our kit properly or whatever. And we thought buses were coming back for us or something to take us back to the hotel. Nope. No bus. And so they just lived in this boot camp for a few weeks where they had Dale Dye, who's kind of this recognizable military figure. He's always playing like, colonel, whatever in the movies, this Southern military leader who is basically like running around with guys in the forest to shoot at them with blanks all through the night, forcing them to do these like 24-hour shifts. And the whole intent for this boot camp wasn't to get them to be buddies, unlike some of the other movies we've seen, like Stand By Me, where he just wanted the kid, Rob Reiner wanted the kid actors to be best friends. In this case, Oliver Stone wanted all of them to be exhausted and angry and on edge, just like they were real soldiers that he'd been in the jungle with. Now, I mean, I find that pretty fascinating because all of a sudden, after 2 weeks out in the jungle, not sleeping more than a few hours a night, being shot at and never having a comfy bed to sleep in, suddenly action, let's go. We're shooting real scenes. Like, that is quite an experience, especially for some of these folks who have never really done much acting before.
Yeah, I think that this definitely sounds like the worst version of the director boot camp that we've talked about so far, where it's sort of like 2 weeks of theater camp for Stand By Me, or like, we all rented cottages that were close to each other for Empire Records, and we had dinners and smoked weed. It's like, no, we got dropped in the jungle with packs and were shot at, and and to your point, Chris, like I've read some stories of like Forrest Whitaker having to be like medevaced out after like slashing open his thumb, almost losing it with a machete when he was trying to open a coconut, and just like bananas stuff. Coconuts.
Or coconut stuff in this particular case. Yeah. I think a lot of it goes back to, a big chunk of this is budget too, right? I mean, we kind of touched on that early on. They had $6 million. They filmed this in the Philippines, and it was really, like, what can we get away with here? And I think that had a lot of influence on how this movie was shot. But maybe let's take a quick break here. And when we come back, we can talk about how that budget impacted the way this movie was shot and winds up looking and sounding. And we can tell you all about that on the other side. We'll be right back. All right. Welcome back. So we're going to talk about how this movie basically got made on a shoestring. And I think one of the early things we can point at here is the cinematography and how this was shot. So this movie was shot almost entirely handheld. Evan, as an avowed hater of the handheld camera, how did you feel about the way this movie was shot?
You know what? I am an avowed hater of shaky cam. Very, very much so. But this handheld, I thought, worked extremely effectively. And it was, they're creating a sense of intimacy and claustrophobia, just really, really ups the tension. And while it was handheld, it wasn't like crazy shaky cam, which is the thing that really bothers me. That first shot in Bruges where there just feels like somebody's just whipping a camera all around. That's the kind of shaky cam that I hate. This handheld was really good, really effective. I'm sure really helped the budget, really helped set that use of tension. And then when you have those moments where, the chopper takes to the air, you get those aerials and you see the scope of the devastation of things that has happened. It is so powerful in its juxtaposition. So I give big thumbs up to this handheld camera.
Not just the camera, because I agree with you. It's not about the handheld versus not. It's how you use it. And so on that side, you feel like you're actually part of it. You feel like you're there with them, and it's really, really effective in how they tell it. I also think, because I'd read this thing around, they deliberately didn't do things like the massive, later in the 80s, you would see all these action movies with anytime someone fires a gun, it's got like these massive muscle kind of like, flashes and everything's just big and in your face. Here, you don't have that. You don't have the big explosions. You don't have the big, gunfire things, but in a way that actually works because it's more visceral. You feel the shots more. You feel the impact. You feel the action. It is more terrifying. It's more scary when they sit there and just wait for the enemy to show up. So I actually think that all of these decisions, whether it was budget driven or not, like it actually works in favor of the movie and the experience.
That's right. I agree entirely. I mean, I think it goes back to recognizing as the starting point that, hey, we don't have much money, so how can we make this work? Well, we don't have the time to set up these elaborate, dolly shots through the jungle where we're going to have to tear half the jungle down and lay tracks. And like, okay, great. We'll do it as a handheld. And we'll go from there. To your point, Michael, part of the thing too about no muzzle flashes was Oliver Stone talked about wanting it to be more realistic to his experience of real combat, right? Real guns don't have these massive muzzle flashes like they do in the movies. So, okay, great. Because now we don't need the special effects people who have to come in and make sure that the guns are firing the right way and the right kind of ammunition. And okay, we can just fire blanks and not worry about it. And so I think it actually gives that sense of a very different sense of these battles than you might have in other movies where there's less firepower, less artillery, less gunfire, less whatever. And also a lot of this is taking place at a very different distance than you're maybe used to in other movies, because you don't see almost any of the enemies in this movie. In fact, the only people from like the Vietnamese people that you really see up close are the villagers, right? Everybody else is kind of these nameless, faceless people at a distance.
Close to the very end when they do the trench warfare. And makes it even more shocking at that point when you have this thing where someone jumps up and literally just like does
right on top of you
and does the sort of like the bayonet stabbing right in the gut. And that makes it even more shocking because, like you say, up to that point, it's just been firing into the brush.
I think one of the things that's critical to this movie as well is just the pacing and editing, because it really gives you this tension and release of these very quick, choppy battle scenes where you feel disoriented, you feel lost in the middle of these battles. I think similar to that feeling of what it's likely to be like for a real person. And then coming back to these more slower paced scenes in the bunkers. Like for each of you, how big a role did that kind of pacing play for you in this movie playing out?
I mean, I thought the pacing in this movie was fantastic. And to your point, Chris, that tension and release becomes so visceral because you are so tense when the platoon is out there getting shot at or finding traps, getting blown up by traps. And as you said, there's no muzzle flashes. There's no tanks crashing along through the jungle at them. The explosions that they encounter when they're not sort of American bombardment are small and devastating, and so people just vaporize right beside you, kind of thing, and you're still relatively okay, or you take a piece of shrapnel, and so when you end up back at base in those moments where it's like, oh, okay, we're off, these guys are smoking weed in their bunker, and these guys are drinking and playing cards in there. That sense of like, oh my God, they're no one's going to snipe at them right now is such a relief. And it really sort of puts you right on side with those soldiers on leave, where it's like, oh, finally you can breathe. Okay, what do you do now? You escape.
I think that's exactly the point of this movie. It's like, this is not a movie about a particular battle. It's not a movie about, 3 days in whatever. It literally is a movie that counts, the 365 days until you get to go home. So it's 365 days that then include a lot of latrine duty and then go on a night mission and this and that. Like the pacing is brilliant because it's not centered around a particular battle. It is, he arrives on his tour of duty and then he looks forward to when he gets to go home. That's it. and then there are things that happen in between, and it just so happens that it's got this really good pacing in between. It kind of leads up. It's got these dramatic moments, but everyone's just counting the days that I get to go home, and that's it. Like, there's not, oh, we're waiting for this big invasion that we will do for the enemy stronghold. It's like, no, it's just day to day to day to day, and if you do enough of those days, you get to go home.
And then it blows my mind again that everyone's counting their 365, and Stone was there for 2 years.
All right. So one of the important things I want to talk about before we call it here is just the sound and music in this movie. So for each of you, how critical was the way that this movie sounded in terms of driving the overall narrative and emotional sense of what was going on?
Well, this is one of those things where I might take a little bit of a backseat because sound design is often lost on me a little bit because of a hearing deficit that I have, being deaf in my right ear. So, but I will say, in terms of the music, it was one of the one times where I was like, oh, this is where the film is maybe a little bit on the nose. Adagio for strings in those, the big, combat death scenes, the Merle Haggard song, playing where the troops are drinking beer and the
I don't smoke marijuana.
Exactly.
Yeah,
and
that
juxtaposed,
one. Yeah.
I think, like right away with the guys smoking weed, listening to Jefferson Airplane's White Rabbit. So it's like, it's really like, that's where I was like, oh, okay. Like, they are not being subtle here, but you know what? I mean, who am I to say that it doesn't work? Because it works super effectively. It's just very on the nose.
But this is where it would be so interesting to be at the table at the time to kind of know how much of this was like the Spielberg Jaws thing. How much of this was the shark didn't work, and then therefore we didn't see enough of it, and in the end it was even better. Versus, no, it was a deliberate decision just to use like the two songs and whatever. So just listening to it, I think that the what you mentioned around like the music with the strings, it's incredibly powerful because it's such a contrast to what's going on at the time. Now, was it because they could only afford one song? Was it because they only had, like, who knows, right? But for me as a viewer, I thought that was very powerful. I also think that they made really good use of a lot of the silence. They're in the jungle. There's a lot of this ambient sound, and they're just waiting. They're just like, nothing is going on. They don't know what the heck is happening. And then suddenly something happens very quickly. And I thought that was very, very good use of sound, like the contrast between that, just the endless waiting around what's going to happen. And then suddenly, wow, a lot of activity happening. So for me, it was very well done. But again, how much of that was conscious decision versus, we have like $1.50 to spend on sound. Where do you want to spend it on next?
Yeah, I mean, I think the Adagio for strings, like the main theme for this movie, for me is pretty impactful, especially, when you go to that scene where, they realize Elias has been left behind after Barnes has said, oh, he's dead. I saw his body. Let's go. And then you see him running through this field, trying to escape, trying to get back. And like, you don't have a lot of special effects. You see him being shot, but there's no like blood explosions, blood packs going off, right? Like, he's just, I think, making those movements of being shot. And it's, for me, having seen this movie so many times, still when that music comes into that scene, I get a little choked up. I'm like, oh God, this is terrible. This is so upsetting. Just as that music comes in. But I think becoming more aware of the sound design in each time I've watched this, to Evan's point, this is a movie that won an Academy Award for its sound design because the use of panning on the sound effects, bomb mortars or whatever going off on different sides, gunfire going off on different sides, helicopters being panned overhead so that they sound as if they're coming from somewhere other than, all around you. It's actually this directional sense helps, I found, really lend to that sense of disorientation in some of those battles, that some of the editing and camera work and things that we've talked about as well. So I just found, it may have all been done on a budget, but it all felt very intentional. And so much of this movie is that, like, well, sure, we don't have a lot of stuff available to us, but what are the choices that we're going to make that are all going to line up with each other? And I think that's where a lot of these things have come together really well, right? How it was shot, handheld, gives you that sense of claustrophobia, how it's edited to create disorientation, how the sound helps create some of that disorientation as well, or that silence in those more calm moments really ties all of those other parts together for me. Which maybe then brings us to one question I did have about the sound. Were the voiceovers effective for each of you?
Well, I think Michael said earlier that they were incredibly effective for him. I found that they worked quite well. I'm usually not a fan of that sort of like letter home kind of voiceover sort of thing, but there was no one that Taylor really could have spoken to in that way to give us that sort of depth and view into his situation and into his mind and headspace at the time. And that is so critical to the film. So I'm going to say that it's actually like really effective. So there's a whole lot of things in this film that normally I don't like. The handheld and the voiceover, but it all works really well for me in this film. It's like, oh, this is it done well. Oh my God. I'm so glad it can be done.
I agree. Like, that's why I said earlier to say, I normally don't like when you do like all this exposition to say, oh, this is how the entire world works. But this mechanism in this case works so well to explain this thing around the newbies, with this, with that, like the scene when they're walking up to this village, and it kind of says like, on that day we loved Sergeant Barnes because he was there for us. Like he was our Captain Ahab, and we like that. It means something the way that he does the voiceover. So for me, it actually really, really works, because I can't imagine otherwise. You would have two characters talk to each other and say, oh, that Sergeant Barnes, he really is such and such. It just wouldn't work. But here, it's got like this calmness, and you get like everything that you need to know in a small soundbite. And for me, it really works. And
then it disappears for a little bit, and and they actually call it out, where it's like, "Hey, Taylor, you haven't been writing those letters." It's like, oh. And at that point, I hadn't even realized that the voiceover had disappeared. I was so invested. And it's like, oh my gosh, like, oh, that's so interesting that you're calling that out too. So that, don't you have anybody to write? It's like, yeah, I'm not doing it right now.
Yeah, I definitely hear you there, though. Like, I think there's definitely a connectivity that happens throughout the movie for me that really worked. I didn't love the last one, but what are you going to do? So before we go, maybe we just touch on some of the questions that we had after watching this movie. So one of the questions I had is, if you had to pick two characters, one you would want to be stuck in a foxhole with, the other you would never want to be stuck in a foxhole with, are there any characters in this movie who stand out?
Ooh, that's a really good question, especially because like names have sort of disappeared for me. I don't think that I would want to be stuck in a foxhole with Bunny, Kevin Dillon's character, because he is becoming a terrifying sociopath and the Black Mirror version of Charlie Sheen as Chris Taylor. So I'm going to say, I don't want to be with Bunny in a foxhole. Also, I never want to be in a foxhole. So I think that's the other thing. I don't know, in terms of like the person I'd want to be in the foxhole with. I'll Elias, maybe, or Lerner, played by Johnny Depp, not because I want to be in a foxhole with Johnny Depp, but because he was the guy who spoke Vietnamese.
Could be handy.
Could be handy.
Yeah.
So for me, I think they're the ones I would not want to be in. I actually disagree with you, because in a foxhole, you would want someone potentially who is a little bit, because at least they will be there to kind of help to fend off the enemy. The people I would not want to be in a foxhole with would be the junior character,
who's just trying to get out of everything.
Right. And then also O'Neill, who ended up hiding underneath the dead bodies just to like not be discovered. And then said, "Oh, they abandoned me at the end, man." Like they were just like, "Oh, I was here." So I would not want to be with those if it came down to surviving. The ones that I would, it was actually really funny because I wrote down this thing around the Taylor character. Towards the end, he was more inspirational in a way than some of the others, because he was like, I'm going to stay here. I'm going to do this. And he actually convinced his fellow soldier to kind of do it with him. So with him being there and being like, "No, we're going to stay here. We have no option." That is the sort of person I would want to be with, because it's just someone who's like, "Okay, fine, we're in this together." So like that would be my choice.
Yeah, you guys both had answers that I had. So that I'm 100% there with you. Out of curiosity, I mean, we did this for Vertigo, directors putting themselves in their own movies. Did you guys catch Oliver Stone's little cameo appearance in this one?
Man, I was watching along, and then suddenly there's a guy in the tent being some kind of sergeant. And I was like, whoa, is that Oliver Stone? Like, is he about to get blown up? And
is that right?
Yeah.
Because I thought I noticed him as someone when right towards the end when they were all assaulting, and he was out on the middle of a field saying whatever, like, "Hey, stupid, where are you going?" And that was him. Not in a tent, but out on open ground.
No, he was in the bunker when, like in the middle of the attack, when they like are now through the perimeter, and there's the guy who
bomber jumps into the bunker.
Yeah, he's the company or the platoon commander or company commander, whatever it is, who's in the bunker calling out orders and whatever on the phone, and then the guy runs in and kaboom. But yeah, it's one of those fun moments where it's like, hey, we need a couple extra guys. Speaking of which, just an amusing thing to me, Dale Dye, who is their military consultant and plays the commanding officer who has a few bits in this movie, to fill a bunch of those extra roles, apparently appeared in like 4 or 5 different ways in this movie, ranging from the commander of the crew there. He was not only the voices on the radio, but he also appeared a number of times in body bags, just because they needed somebody to jump in a body bag when they needed something to carry around. So he'd just be like, "Okay, I'll jump in there. Sure, let's go." Those
body bags did look weighty. Like they looked like there were bodies inside of them.
They were one Dale Dye heavy.
I hope that is now a unit of weight. Like it's just, how many is that? It's 3 Dales. Okay.
So for me, this comes off as a very clearly, anti-war, anti-Vietnam movie. But I'm curious for each of you, like, is that what each of you picked up that this movie and Oliver Stone, I guess specifically, had to say about all of this?
I agree with you entirely that it is an anti-war film, but what I think is really interesting is that it is not an anti-soldier film. And I think that
not at all,
that we start getting, I feel like we've been getting that nuance more and more just in life. I'm against the war in fill in the blank, but I support our troops, kind of thing. So that this really kind of nails down that idea of like, this is anti-war, very much an anti-war film, but it even is dedicated to the soldiers who fought and died in Vietnam at the very end. And, it's that last sort of monologue that Taylor has, that last sort of letter and talking about moving forward from this, and the thing that he needs to carry out of the war is to create something, is to make sure that he teaches future generations so that they don't do this. And very, very sort of clear thesis statement of what Oliver Stone seems to be doing with this film. Really trying to show that Taylor or Stone has been shaped by this experience where they've been through the worst of stuff and have come out to try to rise above it. They've had Barnes and Elias as their sort of, for kind of lack of a better term, like the devil and angel on their shoulders, and that battle for their own morality. And they have transcended, and they've landed more on the Elias side, but have not left with their hands unbloodied. They have murdered Barnes and brought the retribution to Barnes, acting as the sort of judge, jury, and executioner for his murder of Elias. And maybe it all comes down to is that it's not that war is hell, it's that war is purgatory, the worst kind of purgatory. And that ultimately Taylor has been able to just squeak out and get out and sort of rise to a better place, which is not there. And there's a lot of people who are going to be going to hell or stuck in hell.
Okay, so I look at it a little bit differently. I think what's interesting about this is that I don't think that this is a commentary about, again, earlier, because it's not, I mentioned it's not about like the geopolitical thing around a war. This is not about the war. It's not about why did we go to war, what are we trying to achieve. This is about what happens to people who are in a conflict. No one is talking about the right and wrong of the thing. Like that's not, it's much more about the individual people and their leaders. So you have good leaders, you have bad leaders, you have people who side with each other and work as a band of brothers versus not. And that's it. So when you kind of show the lieutenant trying to ingratiate himself with the troops and failing, and you have the captain later who's doing the sacrifice, you have the individual decisions of people fighting with each other. But I'm not sure that this movie is about a comment about war. Maybe instead around war puts people in these crazy situations, and you have to figure out, again, like the sort of person that you are, right? And maybe that's it. So I'm not sure that it's anti-war, pro-war. It's just a commentary of the insanity that, people get thrown into through war. And they even say something about that, like one of the voiceovers, hell is the impossibility of reason. And he says that in his, letter to his grandma. Like, it's just that to say that, that all these old rules don't apply here anymore. Like, now you're in this new place, but he's there for 365 days. Like, that's his deal. So now he has to survive. End of story.
Yeah. I think it's an interesting thing. I think there's a few things you can draw out. And to Evan's point, I definitely think that this is not anti-soldier in the least. And I think even for me, in a lot of ways, like, Barnes is supposed to be the devil, sure, on his shoulder. But in a lot of ways, even Barnes, you understand, and to a point, I'll say to a point, some of the stuff he does, you understand, right? He's trying to protect people. He's trying to achieve the mission. And in a lot of ways, he's the only person holding this group together because the leaders are kind of, out to lunch, don't really understand what's happening. And, he's just trying to achieve this mission. And in some ways, he's being sucked into this vortex of, well, I have to either make these terrible choices to do it this way, or we're going to lose, and then we're all going to get killed and wiped out. And like you can understand some of the logic, and in some ways you're like, well, you can see how you could respect this guy up to a point, right? And then it just goes over that line, which I think drives that wedge in. But I think for me, it's that interesting thing of recognizing that it's this situation that's putting so many people into this position of having to, you know, make these terrible choices, in some cases do these terrible things, which, you know, if they were just back home hanging out, they never would have had to have even been confronted with. And you wouldn't wind up with the, you know, Barneses and Bunnies and whatever, who have kind of sunk into this quagmire of awfulness. And, you know, I don't think those folks were ever getting out of it. And once they've kind of reached a certain level of yuckiness, I think maybe one of the questions then too is just, how do you feel this movie is aged compared to other war films? Like, it was on the AFI's list, and it's frequently up there on the you know, top war movies ever kind of lists that you see. Like, how do you think this compares to some of the other war films out there?
And I think it's a solid contender for one of the best. I think that, to Michael's point, because they're not talking about the geopolitics of it all, that it really is a soldier's eye view of the horror and terror and tension and release, and just the wearing down day to day of these people, and that sort of maintains kind of a timelessness. And I think that this is a great film. This is an extraordinary war film, if that's, you know, if we're going to put those distinctions on it.
Yes, I think partly because of that, like the themes are universal because they avoid talking about something that would have been specific to a period of time and opinions that people had at that time. And then the second thing is, maybe it was because of budgetary reasons or whatever the case was, but they didn't do anything that now looks aged because they did it so poorly. Everything was so raw that, you know, look at it now and you go, well, that's exactly how I wish a contemporary movie maker would have made the shots and the effects. So I think it's aged incredibly well. Like, this is something that you can pick up time and time again and still feel like, wow, this is a very relevant commentary about that period in time.
Well, I couldn't agree with you both more. I think this movie has absolutely held up. And, you know, it's one that I'll be excited to revisit again in the next, 5 or 10 years, like I've kind of been doing for the last little while. Eventually it'll come up again and I'll be happy to watch it when I do. And I think that's probably a good place to call it. So that's what we thought about Platoon. And we'd love to know what you thought about this movie. You can always find us on Twitter at How Did You Miss This? That's HDYMT_pod. And while you're there, do us a favor. Take a look at some of the movies that we're planning on watching soon and send us some questions or thoughts that you might want us to cover when we talk about some of those movies. And while you're out there, do us a favor. Take a second, rate, review, and subscribe, whether that's on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you happen to be listening. And we'll be back with you next week when we're going to be watching Enter the Dragon. We're going to be seeing if it still kicks ass or whether it's a movie that should have stayed missed. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you then.